Well, hey, everybody that is joining us for our conversation today. We're excited to have you. I am Brian Taylor. I'm Slingshot Group's VP of Worship and Creative Arts. And I'm joined today by Matt Wright, who leads our senior leadership division. And in just a moment, our friend Andy Chrisman is going to be joining us. Matt, always good to see you today.
Good to see you too, my friend.
So today we are bringing both of our worlds together, both the senior leaders and senior pastors and the worship pastors and worship leaders, to talk about healthy tensions and how we can develop a thriving relationship together, both on and off the stage, right? Matt, these are things that we experience all the time. And you've got some experience both as that senior leadership space and as a worship pastor.
Yeah, absolutely. So my story, some of you guys know my background. My background after college, going into the corporate world, and then spending many years as a worship pastor before I moved into executive leadership of church. So I've kind of been on both sides of this equation, and I've known situations where it goes really well and situations where it doesn't.
Yeah. And so these are normal tensions, right? As a worship and creative pastor for almost the last 20 years myself, and having roles in organizations where you sit in that in-between space, they can be difficult to navigate, even though they're normal and they're healthy. And that's what we want to talk about today. There's tensions where the answer is not always clear, and where healthy collaboration and relationship is going to be
Right.
vital for us working well together as senior leaders and worship leaders, both on and off the platform. So maybe we start, Matt, by talking about what some of these normal tensions are. I think of things like volunteer versus paid musicians. You know, the idea of what excellence is the right amount of excellence. New songs versus known songs, or maybe original songs versus the CCM top 50. You know,
Right.
what songs should we be singing, and can we sing that song from that place? I think every church has that place in mind that's writing songs. Matt, what are some of the things that you think about from your end?
Oh man, I think, how many times have we all had the conversation about just how much time on the cue sheet should we have for each one of these
Hmm.
components? How much time on the cue sheet goes towards the singing versus toward the sermon versus towards the announcements or the close or whatever? And it feels like there's this constant arm wrestle tension around how much time to put there, or maybe there's the tension conversation around how much input should a pastor or an executive pastor have over programming decisions.
Mm-hmm.
They're not the worship pastor, they're not the worship leader. Should they have input on those songs that we're singing, or where we place whatever this element is in the flow of the service? Here's what I think is the overarching concept of this, Brian. It's normal to have these tensions.
Yeah.
Like, you're not going to get into an environment where you don't have conversations that are tough. You're not going to
Yeah.
get into an environment where we agree on everything all the time. I actually think it's probably healthy that we don't agree on everything all the time. That means we've
Mm.
great leaders around the table. The
Yeah.
big question is, how do we handle the conversations that are tough, where
Absolutely.
maybe the answer isn't as clear? How do we go into that? Does that make sense?
It does. And I think, Matt, that's exactly what we want to talk about today. And for those of you that are joining us, we'd love to know a couple things. Some of you have already jumped in to the comments and let us know where you're joining us from. But we'd also love to know, which side of the table are you sitting on today? Are you a worship leader or a creative leader, or are you a senior or executive leader? So if you haven't already done so, let us know where you're sitting today. And then also along the way, as we talk about these practical solutions and strategies that we have to navigate these conversations in a healthy way, we'd love to know if you have questions that you would like to ask to be part of the conversation. So at any point in our conversation today, go ahead and drop those in the comments and let us know. Okay, so I think, Matt, we can bring in our special guest today,
Great.
Andy Chrisman. So let's go ahead and bring him in. Andy, thank you so much for joining us today. We're glad to have you. And of course, you are an amazing worship leader, but you have a wonderful story. So I'd love to start by giving you the opportunity to share a little bit of that with us.
Brian, Matt, I'm really honored to be here. My story is a little bit unique. I was in Christian music for 20 years, was in the group Truth and then For Him, but God has always had a call of ministry on my life, especially worship ministry. So I knew that eventually I was going to end up back in the church after my days on the road were over. And so I started my career as a worship pastor when I was almost 40 years old. I started, I helped plant a church in Orlando, and then in 2005 was called to be the worship pastor at Church on the Move, where I'm now in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So yeah, that's been my journey. I feel like that God called me to bring some excellence back to the church in the early 2000s, back into worship, and that's what I've been training, my entire career to do, was to, just bring excellent worship and music back to the church where, really hadn't existed prior to that.
Yeah. And what an amazing job you do. I've been privileged to be in the room when you and your team are leading, and you carry that so well. And the balance between approaching things from a pastoral perspective, but having a high sense of artistry. And that's also one of the very normal tensions that I think we experience on Sunday mornings. How do we live into both? Well, thank you for sharing your story. And I'm looking through the comments and seeing we've got a pretty good balance of worship and creative leaders and senior and executive pastors here. So I'm excited for us to jump into talking about these tensions together. So first question, Matt, Andy, I'd love to hear from both of you. And maybe we'll start with you, Andy. How have you seen then things go wrong between senior leaders and worship leaders? We know that that's a real thing that's going to happen. The church is not just about us singing campfire songs around the fire on week to week. There's real tensions that we're navigating. I'm interested to know, where have you seen those go wrong, Andy?
Well, I think the biggest tension is we're just different creatures. As a musician, the reason that I'm hired as the worship pastor, number one, is because I can sing, I can lead the music, I can engage the room for 20 to 30 minutes every weekend to make sure that worship is happening. And so that creative side of me is probably the most active, I would say. It's the thing that I default to the most. Do I take lightly my pastoral duties or my the theological side of things I got to take care of? No, but that's not really the reason you hired me. The reason you hired me is because I'm a musician. I'm a good musician, and I can sing and I can lead the room. So I think that's where the tension starts, is that the senior pastor typically is not a musician. There are different cases of that, but typically is not a musician, doesn't understand the creative brain that a full-time musician is going to have. And there's just those natural, we want things to feel good. We want things to shine brightly, and we want things to move people emotionally, where that's not typically what a senior pastor is going to think about first.
Yeah, Matt, talk to us from the senior leadership side of things.
Yeah.
Where do you see things go wrong?
Yeah. So I think I'll back up where I've seen things go wrong with this. The scriptures teach us to be alert and sober minded, that the enemy prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. And I'm not the person who's wanting to find the devil under every rock. And yet I think the scripture is clearly teaching us, pay attention. Be aware of the fact that there is an enemy who doesn't want our churches to be effective. And if that's true, if there's an enemy who doesn't want our churches to be effective, oftentimes one of our largest vulnerabilities is the relationship between a lead pastor and a worship pastor. That relationship between that lead pastor and the worship pastor is such a vulnerable point. So where have I seen this go wrong? I can't count the number of pastors I have who have broken relationship with their worship pastor, or vice versa. The number of worship pastors who talk about their pastors as if the pastor is the enemy, or the other way around, where this thing turns into a power struggle. Who controls the church? Is it the worship pastor, or is it the lead pastor? Who's got more influence over the church? And it turns into being all about that relationship instead of all about the gospel. instead of all about Jesus. So like your question to me was, how have I seen this go wrong? I've seen this go wrong because the focus is all of a sudden on the stuff instead of the focus being on the gospel, being on the church. And I think it limits the effectiveness of the church when it goes sideways. Does that make sense, Brian?
It does. And I think, there is an element of this where it's a holy work that we do, but it's humans doing the holy work, right? We're
Yeah.
empowered by the Spirit of God and we have the Word of God to guide us. But at the end of the day, we're going to hurt each other's feelings. We're going to say things the wrong way. There's going to be moments where we should have had a different filter or a different lens. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But
Yeah.
the reality is we are humans doing a holy work through the power, empowerment, and strengthening of a holy God. And acknowledging that, I think, is critical to the relationship and navigating. So, Matt, you brought up something that I think we should double click on. So we've acknowledged then that these tensions are normal. And they're healthy. There's an element of them that's just part of the fabric of what you and I are called to do in this space. But maybe for the leader that's listening, that says, I actually don't know. Like if I were to evaluate where this relationship is, where the tensions are right now, I actually don't know how I would evaluate if we're healthier or not healthy. What would you say are some of the warning signs or red flags that might indicate to a leader that what is a normal, healthy tension is starting to move to a place of unhealth? Matt.
Gosh, that's a great question, Brian. Here's I think the way I would encourage you to think about it and to approach it. I don't believe it's wrong that you have conversations that might have an element of conflict in them. It's not a problem. It's not a sign of unhealth that you conflict. How you conflict is what the sign of unhealth is. Does that make sense? So it's going to be normal that you're going to have that conversation that might have some tension in it of, well, do we use volunteers or paid musicians? Because excellence matters, but participation matters. It's going to be normal that you have the conversation of, you're asking me to do that thing, but I need to buy more gear, but I want to do this. And that's going to be, that's a normal tension conversation. But how you handle that conflict is everything. So think about this. I'll give you 3 big ideas. If the way that you're handling that conflict, and first you find that you're going personal in that conflict. So we're not talking about ideology. We move to be talking about interpersonal issues. All of a sudden, we are avoiding the other person. We are allowing this conflict about this particular conversation to color every other conversation that we have. When it goes personal, I think that's a warning sign. Number 2, when it goes universal, I think that's a warning sign. When it goes universal and you find yourself, or you start hearing terms like, you always this, or you never this, or every
exaggerations
time.
and generalizations.
Yes, exaggerations and generalizations. So if we go personal, I think that's a warning sign. If we go universal, I think that's a warning sign. The last one that I have, number 3, is if we realize this is impacting culture. Look, I've got this saying that I like to say all the time, and I heard it from somebody else once, but you're not that smart and they're not that dumb. Like if you think the tension between the lead pastor or the executive pastor and the worship pastor, that nobody else knows that, you're not that smart and they're not that dumb. Everybody knows it. Everybody sees it. And if this disintegrates into an us versus them, a leadership versus the arts, or it's starting to change the way everybody is perceiving everybody else, and it's going kind of this culture place, that's a warning sign. Goes personal, that's a warning sign. Goes universal, that's a warning sign. When it goes to culture, that's a warning sign.
Yeah, that's really good, Matt. And so, Andy, you have the opportunity to lead in a variety of environments. So you get to witness some of these tensions play out in real time in different spaces. And I'm interested to know, share with us, what are some of the trends that you see when these tensions start to go to an unhealthy space?
So I just want to speak to what Matt just said. I thought that was brilliant. It reminds me of a marriage, right? Marriage, the last thing you want to do is what you just described, where and somebody else said here, I think it's Wes said in the comments here, is ego a part of this? Absolutely, it's a big part of this, because The second most visible person in every church is the worship leader or the worship pastor. They have the second most stage time of anybody else in the church, and they're probably not the second in command or the second highest ranking pastor in the church, but yet it's viewed, and the worship pastor feels this, the main worship leader feels this, that I'm as an important part of this church as the lead pastor, the executive pastor, which is true, but that ego does start to come in. So what I have seen in the biggest problems in most of the churches that I work with is that there is this disconnect between the senior pastor and the worship pastor. And a lot of it is because, again, like I said at the beginning, they don't really understand each other. They don't understand the motives of what it takes to do what they do. But ego is a big part of this. One of the things I had to learn as I came off the road from a very successful Christian music career was, as an artist, it was all about me. It was all about how I could make the audience feel. It was all about how I could bring in this sense of excitement into the room when I hit the stage. When I became a worship pastor, I had to walk through some sort of veil to where I was more of a servant to my church than to what I wanted to accomplish on that stage. It also meant I had to be a servant to my senior pastor, and that was really hard for me because not only was I a servant to my senior pastor, but I was a servant to his son, who was 10 years younger than me, who was my creative director, who had the final say over everything that I did. And so I had to quickly learn that it was more about what was best for my church and my leaders than it was for me. And so being able to strike that balance of what's best for the church, but also what's on the cutting edge of creativity and where we want to go as worship leaders. I think that's the biggest thing that I see at churches right now is that clash is worship pastors. And I'm going to put this on worship pastors because I think it's more on worship pastors than it is senior pastors. Is worship pastors don't want to serve the vision of their senior pastor when it comes to worship.
Wow.
And again, we are creative minds. We're always thinking ahead. We don't want to do what we did last week. We don't want to do what we did 3 months ago. We don't want to reuse things. We want to do our own thing and be ahead of things, but you get ahead of your pastor and his vision and what he's really trying to accomplish for the church. And so that's the biggest thing I see. Again, ego for a worship leader, because we are the second most visible person on that stage in that church. And we feel like we should have more decision-making than we're actually getting.
Wow. That's a hard hitter for us, Andy, to talk about. And man, I appreciate, I can appreciate that as a creative, I can look back to my own story and see the times where my own ego's gotten in the way of my effectiveness as a leader. And I think if we're honest with ourselves and take stock of how we've led not just the good steps, but the missteps, we can probably look whatever side of the table you're on today, if you're a senior leader or a worship leader, and say, you know what, I can see the times where my ego, my preference got in the way of me being effective. And that's what we're trying to avoid. That's when those normal, healthy tensions kind of degrade into unhealthy environments that we create, not just for ourselves, but for also those that we're leading, the congregation and the staff and the team. So maybe we can talk together about some potential lenses and filters. I would say we've got 5 habits for senior leaders and worship leaders that we think if we can hold these in every conversation that involves tension, in every one of these conversations that has the potential to be a bit of a flashpoint, if we hold these habits, they can help us navigate these normal tensions in a healthy way. And so the first one that I would say is, number one, we want to fill the gap with trust. Want to fill the gap with trust. Matt, talk to us about that.
Okay, so the idea behind these 5 habits is like anytime you're entering into those conversations, what are the things you need to remember? Like Brian said, the lenses. It's easy when you enter into that potential conflict conversation to fill in the gap with suspicion. To fill in the gap with suspicion. And when you fill in the gap with suspicion, you think about the other person and you make assumptions like, this is somebody who who maybe isn't following God right now, and they're out to get me, and they're all in it for themselves. What I want instead to suggest that all of us, both pastors and worship pastors, all of us remember is that we have the assumption that number one, that I'm talking with somebody who loves Jesus. Number two, I'm talking with somebody who loves me. And number three, I'm talking with somebody who loves the church, wants to serve the church well. If our base assumption about the other person is this is a reasonable, God-loving, me-loving individual that I'm having this conversation with, not somebody who's evil, not somebody who's out to get me, not somebody who's in it for themselves. Assume the best of the other individual. I think that's the first lens, and a critical lens, honestly, Brian.
Yeah, it makes me think too. Sometimes I tend to jump to conclusions. It's like I've got a little court reporter in my mind that's tracking all the facts and everything that's been said. And I sometimes will listen to respond rather than saying, how can I understand what they're trying to communicate? And one of the assumptions that we can make if we're not careful is that they mean to do what they're doing. So we have that narrative and we fill it with suspicion. And then we say, yeah, they meant, when they said that, they meant to hurt me, or they meant to shoot that idea down. They meant to dismiss me or disregard me. And that's just not always the case. We have to assume the best and fill the gap with trust. What you said, I love it. It's not someone who's evil and out to get me. This is someone who's, I love that. Like, this is someone who's a human just like me, trying to serve the church the best that they can. Okay, let's go to number two then. I think one of the healthy habits we have to have is we need to release the idea of our own idea of perfection. Andy, talk to us about this from the creative's perspective.
So there's the idea of perfection from the worship end, and there's the idea of perfection from the lead pastor end, and they're never ever going to match up. They're just not. And one of the things I tell my teams all the time that I work with is that, I don't expect perfection. Number one, because perfection's unattainable. We're humans. We're going to mess up. If you mess up a lyric or a chord, or you say the wrong thing, that is okay, as long as effort and intent are pointing in the right direction. I'm okay with that. The releasing of perfection allows us to be more human on stage, and I actually encourage that. Like, take some chances. Allow the Holy Spirit to lead you in an unfamiliar place, or maybe in a place where you're not totally prepared. So, and there's going to be imperfection in that. And that's what I celebrate. I love that people are different, that they have different ideas than me. And I want to foster that. And I think what my idea of imperfection is might be something that's a strength of someone else. So, I think that's what we sometimes say is imperfection, is that that's not what I had in my head. That's not what I thought I was going to see this weekend. Now on the opposite side of that, one of the things that my lead pastor always used to say to me that I I never wanted to hear was, did you think that through? Did you really think all of these ideas through and these things that were going to happen on stage? And if my answer was no, I knew that I had failed. And to me, that's different than perfection. That is not honoring the flow and the intent of your service every weekend. But to take some chances, man, I would like to see pastors release their worship pastor and their team to take a few more chances now and then, because that's how you build leaders, and that's how you build people who have confidence on stage, and you let them try something and fail. We do that with our kids, right? I'd rather you try something and fail so that you can learn from it. And that's the best way.
Yeah. Go ahead, Matt.
I love the way you challenged us to release our idea of perfection, but that doesn't mean that we release having to prepare. Right. Or that we release having to think it through. Releasing our idea of perfection doesn't give us permission to be unprepared on the platform.
Yeah.
It's not saying that. It's saying we don't want to make an idol out of perfectionism.
Right.
We don't want to make an idol of that one picture that we have in our mind. We can still give our all to honor the God who loves us and saves us. Absolutely. But perfection isn't the goal. That's not what the goal
Yeah.
is. I love that.
I also love, that what we're not saying is suddenly there should be this independence. The best and most effective worship environments are collaborative, right? Every idea is a good idea in isolation. It's not until you bring other people into the conversation that can see things from a different perspective and poke on things a little bit differently than you might poke on them, that you begin to see where some of those holes are. Like, man, did you think that through? That could have been an idea that was crafted and really great in isolation, but as soon as it comes out, I mean, I don't know if anybody that's joining us would share this in the comments. I have good things in my mind sometime to say, then I'm like, that's going to be a great thought or a great exhortation. And as I'm watching those words come out of my mouth on the platform, I go, man, I wonder if that was the best thing or the best way to say that. And so releasing this idea of perfection is also opening ourselves up to collaboration. And thinking, whether you're the senior pastor or the worship pastor, just because it might be an area of expertise doesn't mean your idea is the best idea in the room. And together we get better when we embrace the input and insight and advice and wisdom of others. So I love that, releasing our own ideas of perfection and opening ourselves up to collaboration.
Can I just add this too? I think that one of the greatest gifts a senior pastor can give to their worship pastor is to allow him to make or her to make mistakes. It's okay if you make a mistake. I'm not going to bust you on it as soon as you walk off the stage. We're going to talk about it, and maybe you have some ideas how to make those moments better. But you constrict artists when you hold them to the bounds of perfection, and when you say everything has to be absolutely perfect all the time, and that absolutely goes against what art is all about. And again, like I said at the beginning, you hired us because we're artists and because we love the church and because we feel a need in your church. But the moment that you put those parameters of perfection on us is when we start to wither. And sometimes that's when a lot of those hurt feelings and the animosity starts to grow.
Yeah. That's really good, Andy. So number 2 is release your idea of perfection. And number 3, serve the church first. And I think as a creative, and Andy, you talked about this a little bit, the church is not a vehicle for our artistry. It's not a vehicle just to scratch our creative itch. I love that you said you hired us, yes, because we're an artist, but also because we love the church. And I think it's important to understand that ultimately the investment in the house, its mission and vision and values, and those being embodied and exemplified by every leader, that should be the priority. That should be what our hearts are turned towards. Matt, talk to us about the senior leader's perspective of, like, what does it look like for them to serve the church first? Because I think I can see it from the worship leaders and what we were just talking about, what Andy mentioned, how our artistry should be infused into that mission, vision, and values. But from the senior leader's perspective, what would be good for them to know?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and it's a good point of conversation for us to have. What does it mean to serve the church first? I recently saw a survey, and it was just an interesting contrast where a church was surveyed around what the things that the congregation believed were the most effective at moving them deeper in their faith. And they had a list of like 15 options, things like groups, things like serving, mission trips, devotionals, prayer times together, worship times, the sermon times, so on and so forth. And as they listed them out, the congregation, I don't remember what their top 3 were, but it was probably something along the lines of our daily devotionals, the prayer times, serving the community, and then it was like worship and sermon after that. And then the staff and the pastor did their own. And you better believe that for the pastor, it was like number 1, the sermon time is the most important thing. Number 2, and so here's what it comes down to. It's really tempting for us to think that the thing that we do is the best thing that helps move people ahead in their faith. It's so easy to think that, and that's okay. God wired us up to either be a musician or to be a teacher or to be a shepherd or be a leader, and he wants us to lean into those gifts, and that's okay. Here's what I'll say. I think the reminder to serve the church first is best when applied to ourselves first.
Yeah.
I don't think it's wise for us to give it to somebody else. As a lead pastor, I would tell you, not a good idea to go to your worship pastor and be like, remember, serve the church first. Don't do the song you just wrote, serve the church. Tell yourself, hang on, I need to serve the church first. I don't preach this because this is the sermon I like to preach. Does it serve the church first? Does it serve the church first if we have worship that comes out of the creativity of our own staff and our own volunteers? Or does it serve the church best if the worship is from the top 50 list of CCM or whatever it looks like? It doesn't matter. The point is not whether or not we like this kind of music or we like.
It's not about our preference. Yeah.
It's not about our preference, man. It's about, does it honor and serve the church? It's like, I almost say, you know how doctors have got the Hippocratic Oath about how they have to treat patients and all that, never do no harm, all that do no harm is the Hippocratic Oath. It's like pastors need a Hippocratic Oath. Serve the church first. Before anything else that you do, serve the church first, and always apply it to yourself. Resist the urge to apply it to somebody else.
That's really good. And I love that. Like, can you imagine what these conversations about serving, service planning and programming and messaging and series and all that would look like if everyone was looking at it through that lens?
Yeah.
If the first thought was not, how do I feel about this? But man, how is our church going to feel about this? How is it going to resonate with them? How is this song that I love to sing going to serve the church? Are they going to love to sing it? And if they're not going to love to sing it, is it one that I just need to sing in my car or in my office or in my shower? And I find one that they're going to sing right. These are, I mean, it seems very basic, but sometimes we get going and we push so hard inside of our own momentum that we don't take the time to zoom out and say, wait, is what I'm doing actually hitting the mark of what I'm intending?
Yeah.
Really good conversation. And just a reminder for those of you that are joining us, if you've got questions about some of these tensions or the habits that we're talking about, we'd love to hear them. And so just drop those into the comments. I'm loving some of the nuggets that you all are dropping in there. I love Wes just said, this is really about no shadow missions. Like, you know, this is about being submitted to one mission. It's not about division. It's one vision that we are pursuing together. Really good insight. Okay, let's move on to number 4. Here's the deal. You got to know your role. Know your role. And listen, I get that might feel a little bit sharp. It might be a little bit inflammatory to you, but we have roles that we're supposed to play on the team that God has placed us in. And the authority that's been given to us is not limitless. Not from an organizational sense or a spiritual sense. On both sides of this table, it's important that as we're coming together in conversations and relationship together, that we're very clear about our role. Our pastor is not necessarily supposed to be our buddy, our best friend necessarily. And the worship pastor is not necessarily just supposed to be a minion, but you're supposed to have equal authority and an ability for you to exercise that stewardship of the role that you've been given. Andy, what is the role of a worship pastor in the context of this relationship?
Wow. Well, I think I've said it about 4 times already. It's to create art and to manifest a physical expression for your church to go before the throne of God. And that's what we do. We are the ones out front. Our worship pastor and their team are the ones out front leading the church into the presence of God. And what happens when we get into the presence of God? We change. We have to make a decision. We meet face to face with God in worship. And I don't believe the old adage of we set the table for the message. I don't believe that. I think that's very short-sighted. I believe worship is part of the message. Worship is we understand who God is, and that's why we sing these songs to him and we come before him. So that is the role of the worship pastor. I tell worship pastors all the time, there's only 3 things you got to know how to do. Number 1, you got to know how to do your job. That's you got to take your gifts seriously. You got to make sure you maximize those gifts all throughout your career. The second thing is you got to know the word. You have to know the word so that you're not singing and saying things from the stage that go against the word and the theology of your church. And number 3, we've said this already, you've got to love your church more than you love the gift that you're giving your church. So it's love your gift, love the word, love your church more than what you're doing for them. So in a nutshell, you say know your roles, right? I could go home after work, leave my office every day at the church, come home and lay my head down at the pillow because I knew I did what I was hired to do, and that is get my team ready, get worship ready, and make sure that it is in line with everything else that's going to be done that weekend. It's in the right frame of mind and in the right atmosphere, and I don't have to worry about all the other things that are going on at church that day. I don't have to worry about my pastor's message. I don't have to worry about what's happening in the kids department. I don't have to worry about what's happening in the youth department. I don't have to worry about what's happening in the parking lots or with the ushers. I know my role and I can focus on that. It's one of the greatest gifts I've ever been given as a pastor is this is what we hired you to do. Here's your role. And again, go back to the whole trust thing. I'm not suspicious of what other leaders are doing in their roles. I trust them to do what they're hired to do, and they were all in line for the mission of the church.
Yeah, Matt, that sounds like the kind of worship pastor and leader, that focus and mentality that every senior leader would love to have and to support. What does this mean from because obviously we know that the buck might start with the worship leader, worship pastor, but it doesn't stop there. There is a sense of authority and accountability. There's a load that senior pastors carry as they look at the entirety of the church or the entirety of the organization. What does this look like as the senior pastors that are joining us today and executive pastors try to navigate through this habit?
Yeah, great question. And to underscore what you said earlier, Brian, it's difficult that the worship pastor's got an enormous amount of authority. And yet at the end of the day, the lead pastor is accountable before the board and accountable before God himself. And that's absolutely terrifying. As a lead pastor, our role is eventually we are held accountable before God himself for how we handle this. You look at 2 Corinthians chapter 2, I think it's verse 3, where Paul is talking about coming to the church in Corinth. And he says, I came to you in weakness and in fear with much trembling. It's a weighty thing. What pastors are called to do is a very weighting thing. It should cause us to have some weakness and trembling and some fear because it's a heavy, heavy thing. So what does that look like for us to know our role? I think what it looks like is for us to understand the accountability that we're going to have as senior leaders, and then to remember that Jesus didn't lead with his authority. Jesus led by washing feet. He led with his humility. So knowing your role, I look at it as a pastor, it's a combination of understanding the accountability before God and your and the congregation and the elders that you have held together with the fact that, and my job is to lead with humility, not to lead with authority, but to lead with humility.
Really good. I love that perspective. And we're coming around the bend to our fifth and final habit for us today, which is to lead from the front row. To lead from the front row. Both of these roles are platform leaders, but there's also an element of leadership that we cannot ignore, that we've got to be willing to embrace, leading from the front row when the other leader is on the platform. Andy, talk about this from the worship pastor's point of view. Why does it matter to a worship pastor that their senior pastor is leading from the front row when they're up there leading worship?
Well, the simple answer is that I believe that your senior pastor is the lead worshiper of your church. And however the senior pastor worships, that sets an example for the rest of the church. Not necessarily the worship pastor on the stage or the team on stage. People are going to take their cues from the senior pastor. So, if the posture of the senior pastor is either backstage studying his notes and never out in front lifting his hands and singing, or if the senior pastor is on the front row and they are looking at their phone or they're looking at their notes or in some cases, looking back at the sound console, making comments, all of those things that are not worship, then that's a problem. And I think it's a long-term problem because they're putting all of the emphasis on the worship pastor on stage to lead the church in worship, which is our job. But if the senior pastor doesn't lead out in that way, then it's never going to get to where it could be.
Yeah, That's good. That's a challenge. What you just said is a challenge for all of us, worship leaders and senior leaders, because at some point we're all in the room. It's important for us to, make notes in our brain, not evaluate on our face. And I've been on the platform and known that something was going wrong purely based on the fact that I could see it on my senior pastor's face at the time. And it's a great conversation for us to have. I don't know, again, assuming the best, I don't know that every senior leader knows that. I don't know that every senior leader knows that people are watching them whenever they're in the room. And the same thing is true, I'd say, let's flip that and talk about then the perspective of, I would say from a senior pastor's perspective, for me as a worship and creative leader, it makes me think, what am I communicating to my church and to my pastor when he or she is up speaking? When they're teaching, am I as a kind of if the pastor is supposed to be kind of the lead worshiper, am I taking on the role as lead learner in the room to say, you know what, when I am listening to the message, when I'm engaging with scripture, am I doing it as actively as I expect my senior pastor to do when I'm leading worship? I think that's a really important tension for us to navigate, because when we're in the room, oftentimes our thoughts, I'm thinking about the experience, I'm thinking about the environment, I'm thinking about how that light is hitting, the key light is hitting, the face, or the hair light is hitting the hair, all the things that we think about. And I forget sometimes that when I'm sitting in service, I should be locked in and dialed into what's happening to set the example. I mean, Matt, having been in that role, like, what is the senior leader's perspective? What does that communicate, I wonder, to them when they see their teams engaged in that way?
Oh, it communicates so much. I look at this and I say we need to be disciplined. We need to be students of each other's discipline. And so what I look at that, like, if you're a worship pastor, build playlists of what you're listening to for your lead pastor, and give it to them all the time. If you're a lead pastor, curate some sort of a library of what you're reading right now that you can give to your worship pastors. Even if it has nothing to do with what you're preaching on, show them what you're reading, show them what you're studying, show them what you're into. It goes so far to see the other person engaging. Like my pet peeves. If I see lead pastors who are engaging in the lobby instead of engaging in worship, your congregation is taking cues from that. If you're on your phone during your worship, your congregation is paying attention to that. Be a worshiper. If you are a worship leader and you're in the green room during worship, like you saw earlier, you can't lead from the green room. That this is a little pet peeve of mine, but I understand that our phones are convenient when it comes to scripture and the word. And you might be like, hey, I've got the Bible app up on my phone, I'm following along. Nobody else knows that it's the Bible app. For all we know, you are live tweeting or following something else or whatever. Get a Bible with paper pages and a pen and a journal. And even if you've listened to this sermon 3 times already, I promise there's probably something fresh that God wants to speak to you about this sermon this time. Your job is to be a leader from the front row. And if I'm preaching on stage and I see my worship pastor leading from the front row, it just cultivates so much good in that relationship. It makes me want to lean in with them as they lean in with me. And those are the kinds of things where when we link arms that way, the work that God does in our church is unbelievable, because we're united at that point. Like Jesus prayed for unity. We are displaying that unity for the congregation to see and for our world to see, which I think is a big deal.
Guys, why are we having church in the first place? Is it to put on a show? Is it to put on a service? Is it to have jobs so we can make money and feed ourselves? No, the church exists so we can come together as the body of Christ, worship joyfully and gather together. And when we start to do these things where we're critiquing everything and we're not involved in what is actually happening in the service, then we've taken ourselves out of what the church was created to do in the first place.
Yeah.
And I think it would serve us all really well to just take a breath, go enjoy the weekend, go enjoy the service with your church family.
Yeah, that's really good, Andy. So let's recap our 5 habits. And I've loved this conversation so much. Habit number 1, Fill the gap with trust. Assume the best. Habit number 2, release your idea of perfection. Habit number 3, look at it from the lens of serving the church first. Number 4, know your role. And then number 5, make an intentional effort to lead from the front row, not just when you're on the platform. And so I hope that today's conversation about these habits and these normal tensions that we all experience have been helpful for you. And I wonder, though, if you're sitting here, you might be going, well, what do I do? We've created now this gap, this tension. What do I do if things are out of alignment? What do I do if I'm now noticing that a relationship that I thought was healthy, or a tension that I thought was healthy, has kind of degraded into that unhealthy space? Matt, what would you say? What's something that we can do, a practical action step to move things into the right direction?
I would name the reality. I would take your lead pastors, executive pastors. You need a regular rhythm of relational connection with your worship pastor. You're going to have plenty of meetings at work where you work on the work. You need to have relaxed connections with the other person where you work on the relationship, where you're able to talk about how we do the work, where you're able to get into each other's lives, talk about families, all that kind of stuff. So if you are out of alignment, I would set up every other week, we're going to grab coffee together in the morning, or breakfast or lunch or whatever it be. Get into a neutral environment that is not charged, that is away from the weekend, and let the expressed purpose of that conversation be to build alignment, unity in the relationship. Because if we can get the interpersonal taken care of, the ideological is so much easier. Then we're working on the same problem together rather than working against each other. So that's what I would do. Number 2, I would say get some help. If things are out of alignment and it's bad, don't think that just ignoring this will make it get better. Ignoring this relationship will not make it get better. Get some help. And James chapter 3, blessed are the peacemakers, for those who sow in peace will raise up a harvest of righteousness.
Yeah.
If your desire is a harvest of righteousness for your church, and there is a lack of peace in this relationship, you might need to engage in a peacemaker who can help you figure out, how do we get on the same page? How do we heal relationally and find unity relationally? So I'd invest in it, and I'd get some help.
That's really good. Both sides of this table need to be proactive.
Yeah.
I love what you just said. It's not going to work itself out on its own. Avoiding it is not going to make it better. It's actually going to make the tension worse. We've got to be proactive about leaning into this relationship, naming the realities, acknowledging what is, and set a vision together of what should be and what could be, so that you're working towards, it's not just all the things it's not right now. It's not negative space vision. Let me tell you all the things you're doing wrong, and from there you can figure out what you're doing right. It's actually taking the time to be proactive about casting vision, setting a tone and temperature for the relationship and how we're going to move together. Thank you both so much, Andy and Matt, for being a part of this conversation today. We want to continue to put really great resources and conversations in the hands of ministry leaders all over the place. Thank you for those of you that have joined us as well, for your helpful comments and insights and questions that you've asked along the way. And we do want to mention a couple of practical next steps. If you want help with this, if you want to make sure that you're looking at this from the right way, Slingshot does offer coaching, and we can do assessments to help you get under the hood of the ministry and say, okay, what's working well? What's not working well? What are the things that we wish were different? And how do we get from where we are today to where we want to go? And Matt, you also have a cohort that you run with executive leaders. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, the cohort for executive leaders, real specifically, some cohorts are all about find your people, and they are community heavy but content light. Some cohorts are let's go to famous churches and interview famous people and hope you grab some good nuggets out of that. This is a cohort that's all about deep equipping and a group of community of 10 leaders, and it's a 12-month cohort. It's a lot of fun. There's a link that's right here on the screen. But we launched this thing in Chicago, May 3rd and 4th. And if you're an executive leader, executive pastor, director, chief of staff, whatever it might be, and you think this might be helpful, I'd love to have you be a part of it. I'm going to personally lead it this time. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Awesome. Andy, tell us a little bit about the worship table. This is an initiative that you have going with Michael Neal and Mark Harris as well.
Yeah. So we got together a little over a year ago because God had put it on our hearts to help worship pastors be refreshed, get into community, and to finish their race well. So we are still in development. We had our first retreat back in November with 18 worship pastors from across the country, and it was life changing and beautiful. So we're going to have some more details on that as we go through the rest of this year, as we put this ministry together. So you can go to theworshiptable.com or andychrisman.net, either one, and find out all the information you need to know about the worship table. We just feel like God has again put that on our hearts to help put a place together where worship pastors can come and be seen in an off the stage to develop community and friendships and just have some great conversations about how to finish well.
That's awesome. Really great resources that are available. As always, if you want to know more about Slingshot Group, you can check us out at slingshotgroup.org. All of us are connected on some social media platforms, Instagram, LinkedIn. Maybe not Matt on Instagram, but you can find him on LinkedIn. And then our email addresses are also available, Matt and I, on the Slingshot Group website. But thank you all so much for joining us today. And we have really enjoyed this conversation. Hope these 5 habits serve you and your team well. That's all for now. And we look forward to seeing you again next time.